Hi everyone, and welcome back to our Power of Words and Language series. I think today's is probably the most important, certainly the most fraught that I've done in this series, and that's because I'm going to cover sex, gender, male, female, masculine, feminine, patriarchy, toxic masculinity, and the mature alpha male. And I'm really conscious of how tough and fraught a discussion of these issues can be, which is why I'm doing it. Because I think understanding these terms, the differences between them, what they mean and how they should be used is crucial to the ongoing debate in our society about the role of sex and gender and the relationship between them, between the genders. And so what I'm going to do is record this in bits and edit it together so that I can refer to notes and make sure that I say as clearly as possible what I want to say. And you'll forgive the noise, but there's a massive shore break on the beach today, and I hope it isn't interfering too much with what I've got to say. So I'm really going to start with the easy stuff, I guess, the difference between sex and gender. So sex refers to biological attributes, right? It's the physical or physiological features. So the stuff you commonly hear referred to around, say, chromosomes, gene expression, hormones, etc. So generally, there are only three, there's not a spectrum here. It's male, female, or intersex. And I know that there's modern research that would insert some intermediate points between male and female, but broadly speaking, when we're dealing with physiological expression, we're only talking about those two things. So sex is biological. Far, far more difficult is the issue of gender. Now, gender is a socially constructed role, okay? It's behaviors, it's expressions of identity. And so to give a couple of examples would be girl, woman, boy, man, and gender diverse people, for which there is now, thankfully, a range of designations which allows people to choose from that range and not be confined by it necessarily. And so it's how people perceive themselves and others. By its nature, it's personal, it's subjective, it's certainly not binary or static. And as a result, it exists on a continuum. Now, gender in our society and most societies is somewhat institutionalized. And that's in fact kind of the problem that we're facing at the moment, is that because of that institutionalization and the oppression and suppression that has caused, things are having to change. And it's important for us to understand the difference if we're to participate with love and compassion in that change. So, issues around gender can be a cultural battleground. They are a cultural battleground. And if you want to come into that debate from a position of love and compassion, then you need to understand and you need to use the right language, including the right pronouns. And the right pronouns, he, she, they, them, are the ones that the person asks you to use. Okay? It shouldn't be a political issue, but of course it has become one, primarily because of the debate in Canada and the rise of Jordan Peterson and his insert into the debate, which I don't disagree with, which is going to annoy some people, but because I don't believe that you can politically impose or impose by law gender pronouns. I think that that's an absurd proposition, flies in the face of freedom of expression, freedom of speech. But as a loving, compassionate person, if somebody asks you to call them they or he or she, no matter how you perceive them, then call them that, because that's the loving thing to do. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next part of this. So, Male and female refer to sex and sometimes to gender identity for those of us who identify that way. But masculine and feminine refer to qualities, to attributes, to energy. It's a very different thing, and unfortunately often used interchangeably with male and female meaning sex or gender identity, when in fact they're not really related. And in many ways it's unfortunate that those attributes have been designated masculine and feminine, because that designation causes confusion. And I'm going to try and clear that up, because masculine is not synonymous with male, and neither, of course, is feminine synonymous with female. And so the perception of these qualities, these attributes, has been expressed in so many ways over time, and there's a lot of amazing ancient wisdom attached to this concept. So the best known, I imagine, would be Yin and Yang. We've got Eros and Logos, we've got Shakti and Shiva, sometimes Alpha and Beta, or I don't like that one, I'm going to loop back to that. But what all of these expositions have in common is that they require or recommend balance. And so masculine and feminine, I think I'm going to refer to them as yin and yang, to get away from that sex and gender identity idea and have a look at that, because what, as I said, we're trying to get to here is balance, right? The emphasis is that regardless of your sex and regardless of your gender identity, you can and should embrace the feminine and masculine qualities. Now, these qualities exist in all of us already. It's the imbalance, usually imposed by society, culture, upbringing, conditioning, that causes conflict and disconnection, and is at the root of the understanding and conflict within society, the misunderstanding that currently exists. So I am going to look in more detail at toxic masculinity very, very shortly. But before that, I wanted to look at yin and yang in particular. I'm going to do a whole separate thing on yin and yang later, because it is a much bigger topic than I have time for in this context. But let's look at what has traditionally been listed as the qualities under those headings. So broadly speaking, yin is regarded as the feminine. And within that, and don't be triggered by these words, they will make sense as you think this through. Under yin, the qualities of yin are considered to be passive, receptive, dark, soft, and there are other ones. But if we skip over to yang, traditionally the masculine, the qualities there are active, creative, bright, hard. So there are concepts within there that are both positive and negative, and similarly in yin. The point about yin and yang is that they only really work in balance, when things are in harmony between those two sides of all that exists within us in terms of attributes and qualities. And so when we talk about the masculine and the feminine, it's really in our best interests to divorce that from our concepts of sex and gender, to being male or being female, but looking at how we, however we identify, can live in harmony with our masculine and feminine, with our yin and our yang, how to bring those into harmony, and therefore into harmony with life and the universe. It's extremely important. Don't be trapped by these definitions. Don't let them define you, let them guide you. Let them show you what is already inside you and separate them out from gender. And now we're going to talk about toxic masculinity. Okay, a bit of time has passed. It might be obvious from the light. Look how beautiful that is. It's sunset time. Anyway, I'm moving on to a more difficult element of what I'm trying to say here, and that's dealing with toxic masculinity and the patriarchy. Now, my disclaimer here is that I'm a 57-year-old white man from a very traditional background, and I have to acknowledge my conditioning and my place in all of this. So what I have to say here is very much an opinion. Yes, I've done a lot of research on this, and yes, I have a lot of experience of this in my professional life in the environments I've been in, which include an all-boys boarding school, the army for 2 years, university, sports teams, a professional sports environment, a legal environment. All of those things will have shaped me, but I have tried very, very hard to shake off that conditioning and take a more objective, compassionate and loving view of these issues. But I am not the source of all wisdom on these things. So what I'm expressing here is a combination of researched knowledge and experience and opinion. So take it that way, please. I'm not asking to be attacked on these issues. I'm asking to be educated on them, just as I'm trying to bring a perspective to you guys by making these videos, right? Big long disclaimer that effectively says I don't pretend for 1 second to know 100% what I'm talking about here, and what I'm doing is starting a conversation rather than lecturing you on it. So, toxic masculinity. Firstly, it's not the same thing as the patriarchy. I'll make that clear. But they feed off each other. And you'll see me referring to my notes here because I wanted to be absolutely clear on the points I'm trying to make and not miss anything. Right. In the current ideological turmoil that we find ourselves in, these things are often conflated. Now, toxic masculinity, what is that? It's a false and damaging expression of masculinity as a trait, right? It's a distortion of masculinity as a quality or set of attributes. And it arises from a traditional masculine ideology. It's a conception of how a man should be. And that tends to be expressed in these toxic ways. And the sort of expressions that you'll hear will be a man, or don't be a pussy, or men don't cry, or boys will be boys. And it manifests as violence or aggression or misogyny, distance, coldness, catcalling, all of these toxic traits that arise. Now, these toxic traits are lazily, ignorantly applied then by large swathes of society to all men. So again, arising from toxic masculinity, you will get these generalizations like men are pigs, or men don't know how to show emotion, or men are the root of the world's evils. And that is as toxic a conception as toxic masculinity is toxic, because it doesn't move us anywhere. It creates division, it creates separation, it creates misunderstanding, and it creates resentment amongst small men. It's out of that these male liberation and other ridiculous organizations arise, because men feel attacked and victimized. Now, I'm not saying they are. I mean, that's a pathetic takeaway from the current world situation. It's sad and small and ignorant, but it's there. And the reason it's there is because we talk too casually about these things. We throw blame around, and we don't understand the origin of things or the nature of things. So that is definitely something that arises from the connection with patriarchy. And I think it's very, very important. We need to start applying some compassion, understanding, and research here. We need to look at where toxic masculinity comes from. And its origins are really, strangely enough, in the reaction to the rise of feminism and broader thought on how society ought to be structured, and the feeling amongst some men that they were becoming marginalized by the development of society. Sexual liberation in the 60s through the development of the pill, and the rise of prominence and acceptance of homosexual relationships, and all of these things to a certain group of men were threatening. Now, some came from a relatively interesting and non-judgmental place, just saying, okay, there's these changes in society. And in the 70s and particularly the 80s, they developed this movement, actually primarily driven by the Christian church, but also by other societies, going, let's reclaim masculinity. You know, it gave rise to this men's movement where guys would go off into the bush and create drum circles and sit in sweat lodges and talk about what it meant to be a man, reasserting their conception of masculinity, and then bringing that back to society. And that unfortunately morphed. It of course, you know, had its moment in the sun and then disappeared. And it disappeared because it was a really shitty idea. But the motivation behind it wasn't necessarily shitty. It was just how it came about. But we're seeing the legacy of that in the fact that some men lost the idea of how to be a man, couldn't conceptualize that. And the ultimate combination of that within a patriarchal system, and I'll describe patriarchy in a second, was the culmination of that was the Metoo movement through 2018-19, where the behavior of men like Harvey Weinstein and these dickheads was brought out into the public and was dealt with, which is a great thing, except for the fact that, again, the Me Too movement was perceived by some to demonstrate, to indicate, to show to the world that all men are pigs, right? That this is how men behave. That's not true at all. It's how some men behave. It's how dickhead men behave. It's how men who had no conception of how to really be a man in society, how to live with other people, how to use power in a constructive way, that created their behavior, created Me Too and all of the horribleness that arose from that, the suppression of women, the misogyny over many, many years, and the exploitation of women, the abuse of power, right? And what arose from that in recent years has been this conflation with patriarchy, which I'm going to try and explain now. So, patriarchy. But before that, look how beautiful the sunset here can be. I absolutely adore coming down here at this time of night. It's so beautiful, and particularly watching the ships come back into the harbour after a day out against the backdrop of beautiful clouds and orange sunset. Am I vacillating now away from dealing with this difficult topic? No, I'm not. The patriarchy. Patriarchy is a system of society or government in which traditionally, in which the father or eldest male is the head of the family. Right? That's the origins of it. So what's it become these days, right? It's a system in which men hold power and women are excluded. Okay, that's what it is now popularly conceived of, and correctly, right? It revolves these days around property and power. So control of capital, control of political power, and control of the media. So the message, the means, and the means of control and the means of doing anything, capital, money, property. And that is what the patriarchy is. It's a system. Now, the system is served by structures that have been created over decades and sometimes centuries. And they're upheld, these structures are upheld by inertia. In other words, they're hard to change and it's all people know. They're upheld by ignorance. And then finally, they're upheld by a small group because those previous factors are upheld by the masses, by all people, men and women, all people, those structures. And then this is underpinned and finally upheld by a small group of scared, fearful men. very powerful men. We see this throughout world governments, we see this in business, we see it in the media, right? But it's a very, very small group of people who benefit directly, individually, from the existence of the patriarchal system. It forces us to ask the question, now bear in mind that these are men, broadly speaking, of total self-interest, right? They have no vision, no sense of belonging, no acceptance of their own unhappiness, or understanding of the emptiness of their worldview. Okay, so you have to ask, well, why does it continue in that case? You know, why is it so strong? Why does it continue to affect our lives? And there's one of the boats coming in. Absolute favorite part of my day, watching these guys come home. So many analogies. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. The system continues for a bunch of reasons. Let's go back and ask, who does it serve? Who does the system serve? And the answer is practically nobody. Practically nobody. Ordinary men, women, and children. Rich, poor, anywhere in the world. Nobody really benefits from the system because it even hurts the people who uphold it, because it separates them from so much that would bring them joy, peace, and prosperity. Excluding women from the workforce, for example, is just so idiotic that it doesn't even bear thinking about. Denying girls education, again, idiotic, and causes economic hardship, underpins the lack of development of the world. So patriarchy as a system, whilst it had its day at a time when we were all at each other's throats and you needed physical strength and protection by men, by strong men, those days are long gone, and the system no longer serves us. It no longer serves anybody. So why does it continue? Well, it continues because it is supported by fear, separation, and the demonization of the alternatives. That is what keeps it in power. Inertia, fear, separation, and the demonization of the possible alternatives, right? So how does it manifest? It manifests currently, particularly in the Western world, as white supremacy, the rising of certain militaristic organizations like the Proud Boys, the English Defence League, all of these sad little men. Brexit is a result of the patriarchy and ignorance and the systems that underpin it. Racism. People, men, women, desperately clinging on to or reclaiming, trying to reclaim entitlements they think they've lost. And you know, that really gives rise to racism, and racism is a patriarchal import. Demonization of the threats to patriarchy. Embracing, I'm about to get eaten. Hello, look at that. Oh dear. I'm facing a threat. So the demonization of threats to the patriarchy, and in particular the avoidance of dealing with the patriarchy through the embracing of conspiracy theories. This is part of conspiracy theories, are part of what underpins the patriarchy, because it allows certain men, the likes of Donald Trump, the likes of Boris Johnson, to stand up and say, we're fighting for you, we're here for you, we're what you need, in the face of fear, ignorance, and these conspiracies. And so when you look at how certain people who have, or at least purport to have viable alternatives, or who criticize the patriarchy, they are demonized, they are made other, they are made to look comical or somehow unreal. So if you look at, for example, the reaction to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in America and the squad of congresswomen who she makes up a part of, or the environmental movement, or the way in which climate change is being addressed within people supporting the patriarchy. We look at what's just happened in Texas, for example. massive failure of government and planning being blamed on things that haven't even happened yet. So suddenly this crisis of even something as basic as the provision of power, electricity and power, gas, is being blamed on an environmental movement that accounts for something like 12% of the power in the whole state. But this is part of the patriarchy, or at least the sustaining of the patriarchy. If we look at the way in which feminism, for example, is largely described, and you can barely hear the word feminism these days without the word being added at the beginning of radical, right? So in other words, these days when you think of feminism, or when many people think of feminism, by the way in which it's portrayed in the mainstream media, you immediately think of radical feminism, radical left-leaning. And if you apply these negatively connotated words to things, then of course you create a sense of pointlessness, demonization of these concepts. And so the patriarchy is sustained by all of these things, by control of the political process, the capital, the money, the property, and the media that gives you the message. And so we're stuck in a system that has got nothing to do with men as a broad generality, and has actually got nothing to do with the qualities, the attributes of masculinity, right? The correct attributes of masculinity, and everything to do with fear, separation, and ignorance. And it is sustained by both men and women. It is sustained by all people. You know, who decides who stands for government? Who decides who to vote for? Not a bunch of men. It's a bunch of people, including men and women. The system of government, of culture, of society is sustained by all members of society, not just men. And I know that the messaging is controlled by some powerful men, right? But we have alternatives that we don't embrace. And we don't embrace them because we don't examine those alternatives with objectivity and with research. We are put off them by idiotic conspiracy theories like QAnon and all of this stuff that's going on in the world, that is the lazy man's idea of research and engagement. And of course we saw this result in the storming of the Capitol in America post the election, after incitement by the likes of Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, and Josh Hawley, and those assholes that currently are elected in America by men and women, right? This is not a male problem, it's a societal problem. And I think we really, really need to make that point. Then finally, just to finish on this particular point, the overlap with toxic masculinity. And what we're looking at here are organizations like the Proud Boys. I've never heard of anything so pathetic in all my life. They make people that they've brainwashed into signing up sign a no masturbation, no FAP commitment, because somehow they've come to believe that the act of masturbation or ejaculation is the wasting of masculine energy. If you give that 10 seconds thought, you realize how dumb that is, and how distorted and how manipulative that is. But it's much worse than that, right? Because what these are people striving for a world, an existence, an identity that never existed. It never existed. It's an idea that somebody has sold these poor, ignorant people, and they are being used. And they're just floundering for a sense of identity. And somebody's come along and said, hey, this is your proper identity as a man. And they've bought it because they don't know any better. And it's desperately sad. They don't know how to be men. So let's start looking at some actual solutions here. I hope we agree that we've all got a problem, and that therefore the solution is something for all of us. That coming to a solution that works better for society is a duty that we all have to address, because we're all complicit. We're all complicit in this. So I liken this to the fact that it's emerged since the Black Lives Matters protests arose. And I'm not saying that there's a need in any way to support the BLM organization or movement, but I don't think that it's in question that all Black Lives matter. Of course they do. And I don't want to get into that all lives matter nonsense. The black community, broadly speaking, has been mistreated and suppressed for 400 odd years, and they need our help. But as I say, I'm not making any comment on the movement itself, the organization behind those protests. What I am making the point is that what emerged from that was the notion, the correct notion in my view, that it's not enough to just be not racist, and that it's actually incumbent on us, particularly as Western whites, white people, that we have a duty to be anti-racist. And I raise that because I think the same issue arises with respect to the patriarchy and toxic masculinity, gender politics right now, is that if we want to end the patriarchy then, and toxic masculinity and gender discrimination, misogyny, we have a duty to be actively anti those things. It's not good enough to just be against them, to not support them. It's a duty that we have to be anti them because they're damaging to all of the society and the future of ourselves and our children. And so we have to work together. And we also, of course, have to have a very clear idea of what we want to replace these outdated ideas. So what do we want in place? It's no good saying get rid of the patriarchy if we don't know what we want in its place. So what are we in favor of? Not just what are we against. Now, men, I'm going to talk to you first. Let's hold each other accountable. It's not a woman's job to tell us how not to be a misogynistic asshole. It's our job to know that, right? To embrace the feminine qualities, to truly embody the fact that the other part of our species is as valid, is equal, has as much to contribute as we do. Okay, so the way we're going to do that is to hold all of each other accountable for our language, our attitudes, our actions, our affirmations, and to be a lot more active in calling out shitty behavior amongst ourselves, shitty attitudes, shitty ways of expressing ourselves. Okay? Women, now, to you guys as well, call us out, but with compassion, not attacking, not threatening, not holding our relationships hostage to our need to change, our desire to change. Come at this with love and compassion. Okay? Stop generalizing. Welcome, for example, the expression of emotions. Grow up about your bad boy complexes and fantasies. Because when you give the message that it's bad boys that you're attracted to, that you like, that you're sexually attracted to, that those are the ones that you desire, you reinforce that behavior in men. Okay? Because if what you're saying is, oh, I love men to be open and honest and express their emotions, but your actions in response to that are to push those guys into the friend zone and still sleep with the assholes that you meet who treat you like shit, then you're not going to get anywhere, because the sex drive amongst men is as strong as it is in you. And if what is modeled for them is that what gets them laid, gets us laid, is us being detached, unemotional, cold assholes, then that's how we're going to behave. And so check yourselves and your attitudes with respect to what you find desirable, and don't speak with forked tongue. I love Esther Perel's analysis of this, is love wants to know everything, but desire requires mystery. The way to sustain that, to make that work in a relationship, is through communication and not through upholding these patriarchal and paradoxical gender identity issues around secretly loving the bad boy, but also wanting the nice, open, emotionally coherent and mature man. Right? Marry that up through good conversation. Okay? Stop rewarding bad behavior. That's my ask here. Also, for both genders, for men, embrace your feminine qualities. For women, embrace your masculine. There's good on both sides. When you go back to what I said about balance, it's really, really important for all of us, both at an individual and a collective societal level, to recognize and embrace the balance that moves us all forward, to know that we have yin and yang in us and that harmony is required between those two for us to live our best lives. Okay, so women, embrace your masculine. It's not a bad thing. It's been demonized because of our overuse of the idea, the terminology, toxic masculinity. But masculine qualities are not bad. And men, neither are feminine qualities in you. They are laudable. They will help you. They will lead you to be freer and live a better life. So those are things that we can do. Okay, so what should all of us do? We should stop supporting corrupt structures and patriarchal systems. We have to come from love and compassion to create balance. We need to relax about gender roles. We need to advocate for equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. Don't confuse the two things. Let people be whatever they want to be. Stop trying to squeeze them into a box. Education of women, 100% vital. If you're not, and girls, our future is, as a society, the rapidity with which we reach a good place in society, the rapidity with which we combat things like climate change is, in my view, wholly dependent, and include recovery from the pandemic on this, is we have to educate girls, educate and empower women. It's been shown over and over and over again to be the fastest and best route to economic development and advancement in society. Anywhere you go, that applies. So let's advocate for it, and let's all advocate for it. This isn't a women's issue, this is a societal issue. And let's allow gender expression without judgment. This is including recognizing our inherent nature. One of the things that's emerged, for example, in good and consistent studies is that where equality of opportunity has been best provided, and that is generally speaking the Scandinavian countries who do this best, where that's been provided, gender roles have been reinforced. They haven't merged. So in other words, to give a classic example, equality of opportunity when provided does not result in, for example, nurses being 50% male and 50% female. It actually results in a wider gender distribution amongst nurses between predominantly female and a few male. And similarly in other types of work, so that are particularly male-dominated, become more male-dominated, not less, under proper equality of opportunity. Let's embrace that. We are different. Gender role, this idea that men and women are the same but for societal conditioning, has been proven over and over and over again to be wrong. That was an ideology, not a fact. We are different. Let's embrace our difference. So, that's what I think we can do about it. I do have one further point to make. Actually, I've decided not to make it. I've been making so many points here, this is probably somewhat overwhelming. I hope you don't find it so. I hope you find it interesting. Please remember, it is just my opinion. Yes, I've done some research. I've lived some experience. And all I really wanted to do by this was two things. To help you understand that we need to be clear on the terminology and understanding the words we're using, because conflating all of these things doesn't actually help move things forward. And by moving things forward, what I want to do with what I've said today is create an awareness and then action arising from awareness towards the dismantling of the patriarchal system, because it doesn't serve any of us, towards creating far better harmony between men, women, and people who identify differently in their gender identity. In other words, all people. To start getting on, to start leading from love and compassion instead of fear and separation. To understand that it is the system that has created this division amongst us, and that the only way to really address that effectively is to change the system, and that can only be done person by person by person, firstly changing their actions, changing their attitudes, and then changing their way of behaving towards each other. To come from love and compassion, because it's the only place we can come from that creates harmony, love, and a better society. Because we've tried all the other ways and they haven't worked, right? We've tried the use of power and dominance and strong men, supposedly strong men, and trying to go back to some mythical past that never existed. We've tried all of that. Now let's try and move forward in a different way. Let's try and move forward with softness, compassion, and love. Let's make gender a non-issue. Let's make the patriarchy a thing of the past, and let's understand that we're all in this together, and that we need to start working together to find a way of living in harmony and in the best interests of not just people, but our planet, because we're in trouble and we need to do something.